There wasn't one informant among all these people. I mean, isn't this like the basics for an intelligence agency like the Shin Bet, which had one job, Gaza?
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a contributor to the Bulwark. I'm joined by my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and contributing writer to The Atlantic, reporting to us from Jerusalem.
Yes, indeed. I'm sitting here in the beautiful German colony, although very characteristically for Israel. So the street is torn up because they're supposed to put in light rail. They dig down about 8 feet, and lo and behold, they find ancient walls and this, that, and the other thing. So this is just going to be a quintessentially Israeli story of you begin digging and all of a sudden you realize you're in the middle of history. But I'm here to teach.
So now it'll be an archaeological dig instead of a construction project, right?
There are these big signs that keep out archaeological site. I'm here teaching a course at Shalem College, which is an American-style liberal arts college with about 15 students, and they're very impressive. And you really feel what a prolonged war has been doing to them. I've got one student today who was telling me in the last couple of years he's done over 300 days reserve duty, another one over 400 days. But they are a resilient bunch. Eric, you'll introduce our guest, but we don't have time for the full collection of follies that we sometimes discuss. I do want to highlight just two. I mean, once again, the Department of Defense deciding that it's now going to be the Department of War, which is undoubtedly going to enhance a lot of lethality by changing signs around. And then the second thing is the West Point Alumni Association decided to pull the Sylvanus Thayer Award, which is for somebody who's not a graduate of West Point, but who has done service for the United States and the United States Armed Forces, from Tom Hanks, who, of course, Saving Private Ryan and directed Band of Brothers, chairman of the fundraising drive for the National World War II Museum, because he's not the political flavor of the month. And I'll just, without wishing to dilate on this too much, I'll just say, I've noted, alas, that there is frequently a physical courage does not imply moral courage. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I'm not going to, expostulate on any of this, other than to say that the fact is that I hate to rain on the president and the Secretary of Defense's parade, but the Department of Defense is a name that is actually set in statute by the Congress, and it requires congressional action to change it. So if you read the fine print on the president's executive order, it basically says that, Department of War can be a nickname. But of course, that hasn't stopped the secretary from having, the Department of Defense chipped off the walls on the E-ring and, new Department of War, Secretary of War plaques being put up on his office. I mean, the costs of just changing all the stationery is going to, be, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, it's all ridiculous. But, as I said, we're not going to
go there.
We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. But we are very happy to have as a very special guest, Yaakov Katz, who is distinguished former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He now writes for Newsweek and other outlets. He's makes frequent appearances on CNN and other television outlets. And mainly today, to the point, he is the author of While Israel Slept, a new book that discusses the surprise invasion of Israel by Hamas and the attendant atrocities that came with it, and how essentially a guerrilla organization surprised the most powerful military in the Middle East. Yaakov, welcome to Shield of the Republic.
It's really, it's great to be with both of you, and it's a true honor because I've had the opportunity over the years, and we were talking just before, to interview the two of you, and both of you were in a previous book I wrote about the bombing of Syria's nuclear reactor, Shadow Strike. Both of you played key roles in then the Bush administration at the time. So really, to be on your show is a great honor.
Well, it's great to have you with us. Can I, Eric, if you'll allow me, I'd like to ask the opening question. It's a terrific read, and just for the record, everybody watching on YouTube or listening, very much recommend this book if you want to begin to get a grip on what happened on October 7th, 2023, and thereafter. You are obviously covering this in real time as a journalist, and now you've written this book with your co-author. Were there any kind of either major surprises or ways in which you found your judgment about the things that set up those attacks changing? I should point out to our listeners that, obviously it covers the outlines of the attacks. It is not primarily focused on what happened that day, as kind of grim and grisly as it is. And I think that's actually all to the good, because you're trying to explain how did this happen. So again, there's my question.
I mean, the question that we really set out to try to answer, which is the great mystery, is how does a country like Israel, which you two both know very well, is probably, when we look around the world, one of the countries that is most vigilant when it comes to the different threats that it faces on its borders. No one could say that Israel is not aware of enemies or or threats that it faces, whether from Iran or Hezbollah or even Hamas in Gaza, and of course in the West Bank. And it's always been that way, because it's a country that has just been embroiled so deeply in conflict since inception in 1948. Every few years, another war. So this isn't a country that is figuratively ever asleep when it comes to military threats. So how is it that Hamas, which also, when we look at it, they told us everything they were going to do, right? It just became so obvious. Like, you started to look back and see speeches that Yahya Sinwar had given, where he had, the leader of Hamas, where he had basically said, look, we're coming, and we're planning. And then you looked and you saw videos that they were just publishing on Telegram, right? It wasn't even like a secret of them training how to storm a mock IDF base, how to capture someone, throw them over their shoulder, steal them away into a tunnel. It was all there. And I think that, to borrow a phrase from one of your old colleagues, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, it wasn't that we lacked information, it's we lacked imagination. And I think that that's really, to an extent, what happened here for Israel. When we embarked on this work, which was pretty much about a month into the war, Amir and I had signed a book deal before the war, to do a sequel to another book that I had written with Amir called Weapon Wizards, which was how Israel developed some sophisticated military technology. And we wanted to do a follow-up and take it in a different angle. And we had signed that book deal before, in about the summer of 23. And then when the war broke out, it was obviously no longer relevant. We went back to our publisher, St. Martin's Press, and said, we have the pivot here. But little did we know just how deep the failure was, how entrenched Israel was in this state of mind, what we call in Hebrew the conceptia, the paradigm, where I've come to call it the fairy tale, how much we believed in it, how it was from the prime minister at the top all the way down to the battalion commander on the border that morning. And what also really surprised me, to your question, was how much happened that night. In other words, it seemed like it was such a surprise, but really, when you went into it and we met with the different players, the chief of staff, the head of the Shin Bet, all the different generals, how much the alarm bells were ringing, and they were ringing loudly. And again, it was just not seen the right way. It was not interpreted the right way.
And if I could, and maybe you could comment on this, one of the things that really strikes me about your narrative and about the other things that I know about this is it would be a mistake to think of this simply as an intelligence failure. It's a much more systemic kind of failure, because there were a number of ways in which this could have been an even worse disaster if it wasn't for some fortunate rigs. That's kind of hard to believe, but it seems to be the case. And on the other hand, different laydown of forces, even a kind of a modest mobilization of some attack helicopters and so on, and it could have been a lot less. So this is not just a story of an intelligence organization failing.
When you look at it, I use the term "we" because I genuinely believe that we, as in the country, we failed. We being the political echelon, which set the policies, and we could get into where, because the policy of containment that ultimately became the approach to Gaza and the model, the prism through which Israel viewed Gaza, it incubated over time. It wasn't something that just one day popped up and Prime Minister Netanyahu said, okay, this is what we're doing now. It had a process of incubation and at some point was adopted, never formally, but became the prevalent way and the mindset for Israel. And it trickled down to the military. And I mean, you look at it, and there were outliers, and we talk about some of them in the book. You had, for example, Avigdor Lieberman, who is something of a strange character in of itself on the Israeli political landscape, Russian, Moldovan-born, thick Russian accent, mostly has Russian voters, doesn't have lots of military experience, but he was appointed because of political reasons in 2016 to be the defense minister. And just 3-4 months into his role, he wrote an 11-page document where he basically spelled out 1-to-1 back in 2016 what was going to happen 7 years later. And he said, if Hamas is not dealt with now, this will come. And it came. That document was just thrown into a drawer somewhere. So there were the outliers who saw what was happening, tried to warn, but for the most part, Israel was in this all the way from the top down. And I'll tell you even something else that Amir and I spoke about privately between us. As journalists, I was for about 10 years, 11 years, the military reporter for the Jerusalem Post before becoming the editor-in-chief. I was covering those wars and operations in Gaza. I was covering the war in Lebanon. I mean, I was embedded with the IDF for years. I was in those briefings then later as editor, so less frequent. But even as editor with the chief of staff and with the heads of military intelligence, I would get, regular briefings on what's happening. Gaza never came up. It was like, Iran was there, Hezbollah was there, the West Bank was there to some extent. Obviously, after the Russia-Ukraine war began, Russia and its role in the region and its presence in Syria. But Hamas was always viewed as, okay, we got this under control. They're like the bottom of the totem pole of what we need to think about. And I feel just as again, I was just a journalist, right? But I do feel that I could have pushed more. I think all media in Israel could have pushed harder, could have asked tougher questions, could have said, okay, we see what you think, but we're hearing different. We're seeing different. How do you explain this? And we didn't challenge enough. And maybe that says something about the profession, even of journalism to some extent.
Because I think both certainly in the U.S., we live in a kind of amnesiac culture and people don't remember what happened yesterday, much less 20 years ago. Part of, I think, the value of the book is that it does go back and look at, how we got here. And so Israel withdraws from Gaza in 2005 after having occupied it in 1967. And it certainly strikes me that what comes out in your book is that part of, to Eliot's point, it is a systemic failure, but the intelligence failure is quite striking compared to how we see Israel operating against Hezbollah, against Syria, against Iran, where, the intelligence is exquisite. In Gaza, it seems like it was a huge blind spot once Israel withdrew because they weren't physically present and therefore much less able to discern what's going on, except from open sources, as you were saying, which people tend to neglect. I mean, that's, I think, a deficiency of most intelligence agencies, that they devalue open source information as opposed to clandestinely acquired information. But that, along with the then serial conflicts that erupt once Hamas has taken over after the elections in 2006 in Gaza, in 2008-9, and then again, a couple of times. And you make the point that in 2014, when Bibi Netanyahu was prime minister, very reluctant to go into Gaza, even though some of the generals were saying we have to go in to deal with this. And it was that reluctance, that visible reluctance on the part of Israel to re-engage in Gaza, that created, I guess, the perception in Yahya Sinwar's mind that Hamas could actually win a conflict with Israel. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So there's Eric. There's a lot to unpack there, but I'll try to do so. I mean, first of all, there's no doubt that Israel, to a large extent, I don't want to say neglected Gaza from an intelligence perspective, because that's not true. It had lots of collection agencies and a lot of resources were focused on Gaza. But what we also do know is that Israel became a little too overly infatuated with technology. And technology is split into two categories. And this, by the way, also is one of the legs of the containment policy is technology. Israel, from a defensive posture, had Iron Dome, which could swat missiles out of the sky like a mosquito, and gave a false sense of security, some real and some false now, we know. But that rockets aren't a big deal. They don't do anything. We don't have to respond. We don't have to retaliate. They can't really cause damage or casualties. So we don't really care if they fire a rocket. Let them blow off steam. It doesn't mean anything to us. In 2014, and I'll get back to it in a moment, but when they dug those tunnels and they crossed into Israel and killed some Israeli soldiers, Netanyahu was pushed into an operation very limited in its scope. But after the operation ended, he wanted to figure out a way to deal with the tunnels because this was the major strategic threat. And they invested billions of dollars and built what they called the Iron Wall, was given the name. Dug underground, 50, 60 meters. And then that wasn't enough. They also put together these teams with the smartest of the smartest Israelis and seismic experts, sonar experts, geologists, construction guys, you name it, that they created some technology which is still very highly classified that can detect when a tunnel is being dug, where it's being dug pretty much. And then also even it's so sensitive, it can tell you, is it a jackhammer, a shovel, a bulldozer, like what's digging the tunnel? Now, you both know how many people crossed into Israel on October 7th through a tunnel. 0. They all came above ground. So we had all this amazing Iron Dome, Iron Wall, but when it came to October 7th, it wasn't relevant. The other leg of the technology was our collection technology for intelligence. We neglected human intelligence in Gaza. We tell a story in the book of Unit 504, which is one of the premier elite units of military intelligence of Amman. That's the Hebrew acronym. And 504 was scrambled that morning because just happened by coincidence that one of their members was at the Nova Music Festival, got wounded, was caught up there, and they scrambled down south to try to save him. And eventually it led to the unit being dispatched to Gaza. They hadn't been there in years. And I mean, you didn't really even need that story to know that something was deeply wrong here, because while about 3,000 people ultimately crossed into Israel, and about half of them were pillagers and looters who heard what was happening and they came in and they stole and raped and in many cases also murdered. But the main force of Hamas, definitely those who were in the know, appears to be on the morning of the 7th, just a couple hundred. And then they have their forces on alert and they scramble them all. They say, we're going now towards Israel. They didn't know the exact details. But there wasn't one guy who could pick up a phone and call up his Shin Bet handler. There wasn't one informant among all these people. I mean, isn't this like the basics for an intelligence agency like the Shin Bet, which had one job, Gaza? I mean, Palestinian terrorism. And that was a huge failure. Israel has done a lot in the almost 2 years now since to rebuild some of those capabilities. But they were, again, and you also touched on it. Look at what we did as a country in Lebanon with Hezbollah. Everybody knows the pager attack. I mean, that's just one, but it's wow. Wow. Right? Look what Israel did with Iran in the 12-day war, eliminating the scientific leadership, the military leadership. Also, wow, clearly you had people on the ground who were doing some of this for you, right? So you see that when it's not that Gaza was impossible. It's just we weren't focused on Gaza in that way. We weren't giving it the right attention. With the resources and the attention were on Lebanon, were on Iran, and Gaza again, because of also the Iron Dome, the Iron Wall, and other reasons. We said, look, they're there. It's impenetrable. It's contained. They can't do this. They can't get in. And therefore, we don't have to allocate those resources to there. So altogether, this is what led to this massive intelligence failure.
So one of the things you describe in the book, which was fascinating, which I had not heard before, is that there was a very sensitive signals intelligence collection capability that the Israelis had, which would periodically go out. And it goes out before just before the attacks. And you suggest there's a possibility that actually this may have been a very sophisticated cyber attack, which got the Israelis used to the idea that this system would periodically go out, so that they wouldn't get too alarmed when it would actually did go out at the critical moment. And I think I'd like to use that. That's a fascinating story. I'd like to use that as a way in, though, to talk about the other side, because I think that's actually one of the strengths of the book. You have this discussion of Yahya Sinwar, who amazingly goes from 22 years in Israeli prisons, and a few months after he gets out, he's running the whole shebang. And the attacks are they're very sophisticated. They're, the degree of simultaneity, the training and preparation to attack tanks, which they do successfully, to take down a lot of the border posts, to disable the cameras and all that. And then eventually to penetrate. And again, I remember at the time being just stunned by this, that they're able to penetrate the headquarters of the Gaza division. So there's this complete division, and instead of being able to control the battle, the staff are fighting for their lives. So there are two big questions here. One is, why did they miss the sophistication and discipline and training and all that of Hamas? But the converse is true. Where did Hamas get this all from? Is this just all homegrown? Do you think the Iranians played a very large role in this? Where does it all come from? So two rather different questions.
Well, first of all, I mean, it was sophisticated, and it was kind of low tech also, when you think about it, right? It was, we were so high tech and they just went low tech. There weren't tunnels involved. There wasn't anything overly sophisticated. When it came, one word about the system, which still is very classified. We were very limited in what we were able to write in the book. As you both know, there is military censorship in Israel for when writing about matters of national security. But this so-called system, something called like a terminal of sorts, which collects and kind of gathers all the information into one place from various variety of sensors, and can somehow create an alert of something that seems to be off, was constantly broken down. It was seen as a very sensitive system already and would periodically cause trouble. But that issue of whether there was a cyber attack or was not a cyber attack is something that I don't know 100%, whether it was or was not. And I'm not sure that Israel even knows at this point. It was something that some officials thought it was, some officials are not sure it was, but we kind of wrote it in that way because it was left as a big question mark, as so much is definitely still so much time after. What Hamas did, though, I think what they understood, and they had been watching very carefully, and we now know that in the run-up to October 7th, Sinwar, over a period of years, had been normalizing protests along the border. The so-called incendiary devices, the kites, the balloons that they would fly across and set the fields on fire, the protests that would take place there. He was trying to normalize what it means when you have a lot of people near the border in areas that they're not supposed to be. And Israel started to get used to that and started to kind of say, okay, it's just another protest, or it's just another group that's flying another balloon. And sometimes we would respond, they'd fly a balloon, we'd bomb a sand dune. I mean, it was almost ridiculous. Like we would, at some point, the military and Hamas were not talking directly with one another. They were talking to each other through their targets, right? They would do something small, so we'd say, okay, this is what they do, we'll do this. And I think they were studying us. And they were analyzing how we acted and how the military responded. And that's why when they launched their attack, what they did at 6:29 in the morning on October 7th is launch thousands of missiles right away, because they knew that the immediate response would be all of the soldiers into the safe rooms or into the safe protected areas in their bases. And then they took drones, dropped explosive devices on some of the remote control weapons that are along the border on these turrets, on these towers, took out some of the sensors and the cameras. And then within minutes, and we know that it took place within minutes because Israel got its hands on the GoPro cameras of some of the terrorists who infiltrated Israel. And you saw how they were having that last cup of coffee, loading their AK-47s, putting on their vests, and then boarding a motorbike and driving to the border and blowing it up. It was a matter of minutes. And all this is happening while rockets are flying overhead. They're able to get in. Once they infiltrate and they cross the border and they're inside Israel, they do something very smart. They go straight for the communication systems and power systems inside the bases. So they go to the borderline positions, and right away they cut the comms and they cut the eyes and the sensors. So then, even before they storm Nahal Oz, Re'im, Sufa, any one of the bases that are near there, they've basically made it almost virtually impossible for Israel, for the IDF on the border, to coordinate a defense, an effective defense, and even more so, they made it impossible for the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv to understand what's going on the border. And that's how we reached this situation, because everybody asks, where was the Air Force, right? Why wasn't the Air Force there? All you needed were a couple Apache helicopters just mowing down whoever's trying to get into Israel. And the Air Force, as you gentlemen both know very well, the Israeli Air Force is really the outlier almost within Israel and the military. Very structured, very disciplined, very orderly, and works according to like a manual and a book. They don't operate outside in a very, I would say they don't adapt that quickly. Amazing pilots and amazing bravery. And we saw that, for example, throughout this war, and definitely the 12-day war against Iran. But if they're not told where to go, they don't really know how to go there. And if they're not told what the target is, it's very difficult for them to figure that out on their own. So you had a situation where the rockets are being launched, people get aboard their jets, and they fly off to the Mediterranean to protect the gas rigs, the gas rigs that we have there, sorry. Like, who cares about those right now? You got thousands of people flowing into Israel. But there was just nobody there to direct them because, as you mentioned, Eliot, the Gaza division commander, Avi Rosenfeld, is stuck because of the rockets inside the Hamal, the command post inside his base in Re'im. His base is attacked. The terrorists are inside, and he can't even really see what's going on. He can't talk to Tel Aviv. And he's in his mind saying to himself, I'm a commando, because he served in this elite Shaldag unit. I should go out and fight. Do I go out and fight, or do I not go out and fight? Even Herzli Halevi, by the way, right, the chief of staff, who's at home when this erupts and begins, gets into his car and has a thought to actually drive down south to fight himself. Until, I guess, the logic finally kicked in, and he realized, I'm the chief of staff. I mean, the last thing that I should be doing right now is going, and of course he made the right decision, right? He needed to get to headquarters and start to manage this thing. But it was such chaos that no one really knew what to do and how to respond in those initial, definitely, I would say, in the first 5, 6, 7 hours until Israel was finally able to mount something of a response. And for for too many people, it was too late. Like I'll just tell, and I'll stop with this. When they got to Nir Oz, which was one of the kibbutzim along the border, and just for our listeners to understand, Nir Oz, 1 out of 4 residents was either murdered or abducted to Gaza. Not a big kibbutz, just a few hundred people. When the IDF finally got there, they were gone. I mean, there wasn't even who to fight. In Kfar Aza, they had who to fight. In Be'eri, they had who to fight. But Nir Oz, it was over. I mean, the Hamas had come and done what it wanted to do, and that was it. People were still in their homes, and they were able to get them out and rescue them. And pretty much, they were asked one simple question: where were you guys?
Yeah, I've been to Nero's, and a couple months after the attack, and just a horrifying sight. How much worse could it have been?
I think it could have been much worse, and I think that if it weren't for the bravery of a lot of Israelis who, not really knowing what was going on, you're talking to me on a Monday. I had a Shabbat meal with a soldier who lost a leg during this war, young 26-year-old man, served in an elite unit. I mean, he was up north on holiday, because remember, it was the Simchat Torah holiday. It was a holiday here in Israel, and the people were off. They were home. They were with their families, and he heard something had happened. Just got in his car and went down to fight. I mean, if we didn't have those kind of people, and thankfully there were hundreds like him, who literally were not given orders, weren't told what to do. Some were reservists, some were retired generals who didn't really have any job to do anyhow in the military, and just heard that something was happening and that it wasn't going well, and they just went down there and started doing what they could do. So I think the courage and bravery that we saw was remarkable. The courage and bravery of the residents who really put up a fight, those rapid response teams inside the kibbutzim themselves. The police lost about 55, 60 people that day, just stopping Hamas from proceeding. The Hamas almost took over the entire highway called 232, which is that highway that runs parallel to the Mediterranean, but up from the kibbutzim up towards the center of the country. Maybe they would have made it to Ashkelon, to Ashdod, towards Tel Aviv. They got to Ofakim, which is about 30 kilometers away. They tried to attack an intelligence base there. We later discovered that they had on them maps of Air Force bases. They wanted to get to a prison nearby, maybe to release some Palestinian prisoners. They brought with them equipment that seemed to indicate that they were in it for the long haul, and they planned to stay for a while, some of it including like medical equipment to do amputations out in the field, not of the Israelis, but of themselves if someone was severely wounded. So this wasn't just a quick invasion in and out, kidnap a couple of people and call it a day. They wanted to cause even more damage to the state of Israel. I think they were probably, speaking afterwards to the intelligence officials, it seems, and the military guys, they believe that Hamas was planned something big, but was surprised by the sheer lack of resistance and defense by Israel. That's what surprised them. They thought they would have to fight more, and they didn't realize that what they had done had been so successful.
Yeah, catastrophic success, actually. My sense is also they anticipated that Sinwar anticipated that because there was conversation with Hezbollah before the fact, that there would be something coming from the north as well, that once they started, they would trigger something larger, that it was not just going to be them against the IDF. There's something that you write about in the book that is, I think, a kind of a thread or a through line that, kind of connects the Israeli thinking before the fact with the war that's ensued over the last 2 years, and with where we find ourselves today in the current operation. And that is that Israelis are very reluctant to go in 2014 and subsequently to Gaza, because they were afraid of the international reaction. They were afraid of casualties, and they were afraid about the humanitarian situation that would result in Gaza once they went in. Now, obviously, after October 7th, all of that kind of went out the window, at least in the initial phases. But to some degree, it's coming back now, I think, particularly in this latest phase, when Prime Minister Netanyahu has gone back in, but the government and the Prime Minister have not really defined in any kind of way what the end state they anticipate will be the result of these operations in Gaza. And you've written, this is outside, I think, really the ambit of the book, Yaakov, but you've written in some of your columns very poignantly about the sort of difficulty of this, conundrum that Israel faces of being unable to actually define total victory, but wanting obviously to get the hostages back and bring the conflict to an end, and the tension that kind of results from that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, my biggest criticism, Eric, of the way this war has been prosecuted by Israel is that we have not articulated, I think, what it is that we want, right? We use a lot of slogans, what we call in Hebrew sismaot. A lot of slogans are thrown around. The prime minister likes to talk about this thing called nitzachon muchlat, or total or complete victory. Even had hats, baseball hats printed with the slogan. But what does that mean? Because I think that anyone that recognizes the extreme difficulty in fighting this war and fighting an enemy like Hamas understands that we're not going to kill every last Hamas member. I mean, what seems to be happening, and I hear this from the intelligence officials now, is there's probably more Hamas members now than there are Kalashnikov AK-47s in Gaza. And listen, you kill people, they replenish them with just other people who don't have hope or and are desperate, and they're offered a few some money, and they'll join the ranks of Hamas. So what's really needed is, everybody knows, and I don't have to tell you guys, everybody knows Clausewitz's famous line about military is just a means towards a political resolution. So what is that political resolution? This is going to end in some sort of political resolution. What is it? And here I think that there's two mistakes we're making as a country by not articulating the plan. Number one is we are making people believe in Israel that this total victory is possible. And they don't understand, but they think, okay, what do you mean? We have to destroy every last Hamas member. We can't have one left. We can't have a tunnel left. So that creates an expectation that's up here that is never going to be achieved. It's just not possible, right? Even if you were to decide as the Israeli military to occupy Gaza forever and go door to door, we're talking about decades. This is just it's not something that Israel would want to ever find itself in. So you create a very high expectation that can only lead to disappointment and frustration. But the second thing that it also does is it makes it seem as if we have one purpose in this war, and that is just to kill and destroy. And we don't have a different political horizon and vision for what will happen in Gaza. And to the world, and I do care about public opinion, I think that's a bad message to be sending. If we, for example, and I can't say this for certain, but I think that if we, for example, were to say, listen, we're doing this to degrade Hamas, weaken Hamas, bring Hamas to the point that it no longer serves any military threat to Israel, can no longer do anything, then we're going to help facilitate it, a new governing entity that will be made up of A, B, C, D, whoever it is. And they're going to come in and they're going to take over Gaza, and we're going to help them. We're going to keep security control, but really the Palestinians, they're going to control themselves. This is the Palestinian future. I think the world would look at this a little differently potentially. And this government in Israel refuses to do that. That's because of politics, that it can't articulate what that plan is going to look like. And I think that we're causing ourselves damage on the international stage, and we're just making a strategic mistake. And I think that unfortunately, the great successes, and there have been great successes during this war, are going to waste. I mean, one perfect example is what we're talking about now is Israel's on the verge or the eve of a potential mass offensive inside Gaza City. And you talk to the IDF commanders, and they really don't understand what they're going in to do, because we were there. We did this about over a year ago. Now, they didn't go into every single part, and there's some parts, but one of the best examples I give is and you'll remember this, when Israel, a few months into the war, goes to Shifa Hospital, which was really like the big hospital in Gaza City. It's where Hamas was believed to have an underground command center for many years. Israel goes there, clears it out, does it in a very surgical way, minimizes collateral damage really to civilian casualties, almost none at that point, uncovers the tunnels that were there, destroys some of it, and then walks away. And then 2-3 months later, we wake up one morning and we find out that the IDF has surrounded Shifa Hospital and arrested like 700 Hamas members who had taken up positions in Shifa Hospital. And I'm like, so I'm just thinking to myself, I understand, weren't we just at Shifa? So I think what Israel the strategy or the tactic then was we go in, we do something, we walk out. In a real world, I think this was David Petraeus who speaks about the conquer and hold strategy. So either we need to hold it or we needed someone else to hold it. But this idea that we walk away and they're not going to reconstitute was a little foolish. And part of that has perpetuated this war much longer than I think it needed to be. But we also do have to say is that Hamas's success on October 7th, massacring about 1,200 people, taking 251 people hostage, put Israel in a position that it can't just end the war without the hostages. So the hostage element and this dilemma, because I could have told you guys in the beginning on October 8th, we're going to end the war getting back the hostages, but Hamas remains in power. And you might have said to me, that's not a victory. Or vice versa. We'll get the hostages, but we won't get the hostages, but we'll take down Hamas and the hostages will stay. And you would say also, that's not a victory. So to achieve both of these from the day one was always going to be super, super, super complicated.
I mean, obviously the IDF has been through an enormous amount in the last 2 years, not just in Gaza, of course, but with Hezbollah, and there's to some extent in Syria as well. What is your sense of what are the changes in the IDF that this has caused? I mean, I just have this feeling, as I said at the beginning, I've been teaching students who are they're undergraduates, but they're all, I think, in their mid-20s, and they've all, been doing the military service going back and forth. You just have a feeling this is a generation that will be marked by this war in some profound ways. And I have to think that that's true of the broader IDF. Do you have a sense of what that's going to look like? What the IDF after this one is going to look like as a result of this? And maybe not just the IDF, but the entire security establishment? Or is this the kind of thing that, could happen again?
Well, I think tragically it could happen. Strategic surprises can always happen again. But I think that definitely in the short term, the military is in trauma. And it stems from a number of elements, but one is the deep distrust between the top command of the military and the political echelon. And we're seeing that play out now with Eyal Zamir, the current chief of staff, knocking heads with Netanyahu over this Gaza offensive. We saw what happened with Herzi Halevi, who was pushed out, the former chief of staff. So that tension still exists at a time of war, which doesn't transmit well to the public, which would want to see more harmony and unity, especially when making decisions that will lead young men to be killed. That's the brutal truth. But also, I think between the public and the military, there is also something of a broken confidence. I think that probably both of you have been in this room, I'm going to guess, at the Kiryat military headquarters in Tel Aviv on the 14th floor, where the chief of staff has his office and also the defense minister is in the tower across. But in the chief of staff's conference room, where the general staff meets, on the wall behind where he sits, there's a phrase by David Ben-Gurion, a quote in Hebrew that's silver letters on the wall that says, every Jewish mother should know that she is depositing her son in the hands of commanders who are worthy. And I think that's a loose translation. And I think that worthiness, so-called, is now put under question. Do the commanders, are they worthy? And do they know what's happening? So I think that there's trust problems. I think that we can't forget that there are 900 soldiers who have been killed in this war. And there are thousands, literally, who are taken out of action because of wounds and injuries that they have sustained. And that leads to the issue of how the military does not have enough manpower. And you have people, friends of mine, family members of mine, who have served hundreds of days, literally, of reserve duty. I could tell you just a personal story. My youngest brother, mid-30s, did his service in one of the elite Golani units, was called up on October 7th. His unit was sent to the north because his specialty was Lebanon, and spent there about 100 days. And thankfully he's fine, but he got sick with diabetes. And apparently diabetes, I've now learned, it can be brought on is a stress-induced illness. And it turns out that you have dozens of reservists who now are diabetic, right, in their mid-30s. And that's just one little story, but there are so many of these stories out there today of people who have lost their businesses and their jobs and economic hardships now, and not to mention what's going on with their families who they leave behind. So I think the long-term impact here, rebuilding the trust, replenishing the ranks, which touches on the ultra-Orthodox exemption issue, which is just a travesty that continues and that we haven't been able to solve this, is just ridiculous. But it touches on that, and it touches on how do we overcome this great trauma and this great pain that the country still suffers from. And I think that's Israel hasn't healed, and it will take some time for Israel still to heal.
We're coming pretty much to the end of our time, Yaakov. And I wonder if we can close on this, although I recognize this could be an entire, podcast in its own right. But as Eliot suggested in his opening comments or question to you, I mean, this book, which is really, as Eliot said, a great read, is really a book about failure, about a systemic military failure. Your earlier book, Shadow Strike, is in some sense a book about a great success, really, 18 years ago, when Israel discovered a nuclear reactor being built in Western Syria with the help of North Korea. It was a doppelganger of the Yongbyon reactor in North Korea that was the subject of a lot of U.S. diplomacy. Eliot and I were involved in it at the time. And not only did Israel have exquisite intelligence, but ultimately when the U.S. balked about doing anything, the then Prime Minister Ehud Olmert launched a very successful strike that just completely destroyed the reactor. And I think we could all, in light of what's happened subsequently in Syria, we can all be grateful that Syria did not have a nuclear weapons program that went on to produce, a nuclear weapon. But could you talk a little bit about the contrast between writing about this traumatic failure, as you've just described, but on the other hand, this, pretty powerful success? I mean,
it's definitely two very different Israels to an extent, right? Although I would also, Shadow Strike, I think, is a story of the amazing brilliance of Israel in the end. But the discovery of the reactor, we all know, and you both definitely know, was by chance almost. Was almost a fluke. Yeah, by the Israeli, by the Mossad, that it just happened to steal the contents of a computer of a Syrian nuclear scientist in Austria, and then was shocked to see that their nuclear reactor was being built there. And there were other signs that when they looked back, they had seen stuff, and your CIA had seen stuff as well, but it was never kind of put together. And then from there, it was really a remarkable story. But I think that, I do see some comparisons again between strategic surprises and just how we were Israel back in that time in the mid 2000s had also been surprised by the Libyan deal that had been made between Libya and the Bush administration to dismantle their nuclear program. And there was some thinking in Israel, do we know everything that's happening in the nuclear realm in the region? So I think that strategic surprises, we always have to be questioning what it is that we think we know. And we see that happen and play out here. But I also think is just from a storyteller perspective as a writer, of course I want to tell a good story. That's you always want to tell a positive story. And people tell me all the time, Yaakov, you gotta give us some optimism and hope. And I think that really what I felt writing this book, and I've written a few before, but really in this one, I felt a real sense of duty and responsibility, because there's no question that if we don't learn what happened, and this book that Amir and I wrote is no replacement to a commission of inquiry, and we need a state commission of inquiry, because we only have access to people who are willing to talk to us and to some people who are willing to share with us some documents. But at the end of the day, we can't get everything. We don't have the transcripts and the minutes from the war cabinet and the security cabinet meetings before. We don't have the recordings from every meeting the prime minister had with the head of intelligence and the head of the Shabak. We have what we have. But I think what we need to recognize is that we have to learn the lessons. We have to really study what happened so it does not happen again. We owe it to the victims of the war, because there are so many, and they paid the ultimate price of abandonment by the government and by the military. But we also owe it, I think we owe it to our children, to the future Israelis, to the students that Eliot now is teaching in Jerusalem, who are being called to sacrifice, and they need to know that their government and their country and their military has learned those lessons and is applying them and is going to do everything possible to make sure this doesn't happen again. And the truth has to be said is that as we speak, Israel is implementing and adopting some of those lessons, right? Israel has now adopted a preemptive strike policy when it comes to Lebanon, definitely when it comes to Gaza. But we see how Israel, even though there's been a ceasefire in place in Lebanon for about a year, Israel continues to attack when it sees a moving target. It's not becoming complacent again. It's not just jotting down the location of the target for a future target bank. It's acting. That's an important lesson, but there are many more, and we need to really study this so that we can create a safer and more secure country.
I'll just say, since it would be good to end on a more optimistic note, but I'm not sure you'd hear an American journalist say in quite the same way the sorts of things you've said about taking common responsibility for making things better with that level of passion. And I think that's actually the thing I've found inspiring in a way about the students here is they own all this. I don't think they feel simply like victims of larger forces that are out of their control, and that is a positive story.
Every Israeli, this war touched every Israeli in a way. There's no Israeli who doesn't know victims, who doesn't know hostages. Just my family, I have 4 kids in Jerusalem. The number of soldiers who my kids know who were killed in this war, friends of theirs from youth groups, fathers of children who they go to school with, husbands of teachers, people from our community, synagogues that we went to, members of the synagogue whose son was kidnapped. I mentioned my brother. One of his friends from his service is still being held in Gaza as we speak, Elkanah Buchbut. I mean, it just touches you in so many different ways. And I think that, look, I do talk about it passionately because I feel strong. My future is in Israel, and I want to see it. And when you're a father, my daughter just finished up her service as an officer in the IDF just a few days ago after 3 years. And on October 7th, I drove her to the bus that was going to take her back to base and she wasn't a combat soldier, but to a war. And that does, that changes you as a person, and it does something to you as a collective. And I think that you're right, Eliot, that is part of the positive story of Israel is how, for the most part, and we could talk a whole 2 hours about this, but for the most part, we all recognize this idea of being a collective.
Well, Yaakov Katz, thank you so much for spending this time with us. The book, I think, is essential for anybody who wants to understand the origins of this war and what's going on and why it's being conducted the way it is. I hope we can have you back in the future, book or no book, because you're writing constantly, and I always find your columns to be illuminating and help understand a conflict that is not only filled with controversy, but moral dilemmas.
Well, thank you both very much.
Thank you, Yaakov.